All right, good afternoon. I'm Chris Kiergaard, the president of the League of Women Voters of Greater Peoria. Thank you for joining us today for our program, and thank you to our hosts at Illinois Central College. And thank you especially to the folks in marketing who made those great signs to help get you right in and right out. We really appreciate that. The League is a nonpartisan organization focused on voter education, voter rights, and encouraging all eligible people to vote. We don't endorse or support candidates, but we do take positions on issues at the local, state, and national levels, but only after careful study of those issues. As we begin, I want to take a few moments to thank some of the folks who are responsible for putting today's event on. Several League members were really involved and did some heavy lifting in this. I want to recognize first Cheryl Budzinski, who served as a wonderful liaison with our speaker and his staff. Eileen Steed, who kept us all organized, on track, and set in the planning process for our event today, and has been a part of, I think, 4 other special events we have done since the start of this year, focusing on what the impact is at the local and state level of federal action that's being taken. I want to thank Bill Poorman, who's behind the camera today, live streaming this. And I want to take a moment to recognize 2 special guests we have from the State League who are here, Roberta Barino and Becky Simon, who traveled down from Chicagoland to be with us for the event today. Thank you both for taking the time and for supporting our downstate leagues. Our speaker today is going to present to us over the course of 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will have time for Q&A, both from the audience and from me up here. If you don't have any questions, if you do have them, I saw some note cards out there, and we have a couple of folks around the room with them. So if you have a question that you want to write out for us during the event for us to ask our speaker, please do just sort of signal to those with the note cards, and they will collect them and pass them along to me. If we do run a little bit over our planned 1 o'clock conclusion today, I know some of you, particularly students and faculty who are here, might have to scoot to get to your next class or your next appointment, so please feel free to do so. But otherwise, as with all of our events, we ask that you please give our speaker your attention, hold any questions until the end and any reactions until the end, because we're live streaming this for those who could not be here. If you can help us control the ambient noise level as much as possible so that those following on the live stream are able to hear well, we ask that everybody keep things as quiet as possible. So when Cheryl first had the idea for our speaker today, I was immediately on board. As a former longtime political reporter, I already knew what everyone else is sure to see over the next 45 minutes or so, which is that our speaker is one of a tiny, tiny handful of people who truly understand the Illinois state budget, how it works, and what needs to be done to make it work better for the people of the state of Illinois. Ralph Martire is a legislative tax policy expert in Illinois. He's the executive director of the nonpartisan Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, a nonpartisan 501c3 think tank committed to ensuring that state, federal, and local workforce, education, fiscal, economic, and budget policies are fair and just, and to promoting opportunity for all, regardless of race, ethnicity, or income class. He also serves as the Rubloff Professor of Public Policy at Roosevelt University in Chicago. So without further ado, sir, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks. Good afternoon, how are you all doing? I'm tired, old, and cranky, but I'll get over it. I figured I'll take some Tylenol PM this evening because I only like to be autistic at night. All right. So we are going to talk about President Trump's signature legislation. He calls it the Big Beautiful Bill. We tend to call it other things at the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. But I really want to run through some of the philosophical underpinnings of the whole supply side approach to public policy, particularly fiscal policy, as underpinning this and why we could never support supply side and why we really as voters, you as voters, need to make sure you don't support anyone that supports this crazy ideology. So what's the big part of the bill? Here's the big part of the bill. You look at that large orange bar across there. That's the $4.4 trillion in tax cuts over the next 10 years. That's the major part of the bill. A big part of those tax cuts was just extending permanently many of the quote unquote temporary tax cuts from Trump's first time around in office. Then he had some other tax cut provisions. You notice the temporary tax cuts, that little tiny bar up there? That's the things like the tip deduction and the overtime deduction. Those are temporary, they go away. And actually under this legislation, within 3 years, people earning $30,000 a year or less will be paying more in taxes than they did before the bill passed. I just want to be very clear that was thrown in there to hoodwink people into thinking this legislation somehow, some way was about working Americans. It really is not. There's additional spending on defense. There's additional spending on Homeland Security. There's additional spending on ICE. So how did they make up for all this revenue loss and the additional spending that the tax cuts and what they put on the table for defense would cost? Cutting Medicaid, cutting green and environmental investments, cutting student loans, cutting SNAP food benefits, cutting other healthcare programs. I'm going to get into it. Medicare gets cut under this legislation, both directly and indirectly. It's not in the media, and I don't get why it's not in the media, but Medicare is going to be cut as well, and they cut investments in protecting natural resources. So that's partially how they pay for the legislation. It is classic supply side legislation. So what is that? The whole theory of supply side is pretty simple. You cut taxes for businesses and rich people. That frees up a lot of their income to invest in creating jobs for everyone else. That trickle-down effect, right? You also deregulate business. You reduce public sector spending because public sector spending crowds out private sector economic activity. This is the basic theory. And by the way, one of my favorite things about this theory, I don't know how much of you guys follow economics closely. This theory works in good economic times, bad economic times, and mediocre economic. There's no time supply side doesn't work according to its proponents. I've never seen an economic or fiscal approach that works during good and bad times, but according to the theory, this one does. It will stimulate so much economic growth by freeing up the income of affluent individuals and corporations to create jobs and better paying jobs for everyone else, that the economy will grow faster. All these people getting additional and better and higher paying jobs that wouldn't have had them but for the trickle-down effect will pay so much more in taxes because their incomes will go up that actually at the end of the day, the tax cuts pay for themselves. It's a revenue neutral thing that doesn't drive up deficits. That is the theory. How's it worked? Never, ever in any industrialized country have supply side cuts delivered the promised economic benefits. You don't have to believe me on this. Let's start with the London School of Economics, that way crazy liberal organization across the pond. I mean, it's a pretty conservative group. They reviewed every industrialized nation, all 18 of the OECD nations, that engaged in some form of supply side between 1965 and 2015. What did they find? Number one, tax cuts for the rich do increase income inequality, but the impact of cutting taxes on the economy is measured by GDP per capita, unemployment rate, statistically indistinguishable from zero. It has never stimulated the economy in any industrialized nation, including the US, that has done it. It has worsened income inequality, but it has not stimulated the economy. And in fact, economic performance as measured by real GDP growth per capita, unemployment rates are not affected by tax cuts for the rich, cannot possibly create any enhanced economic growth. So number one, if you can't create enhanced economic growth, if there's no trickle down, then they're not going to pay for themselves and your deficits are going to go up. I mean, you know, the theory really falls apart. Then that other really liberal group, the International Monetary Fund, also did a similar study, and it basically said Tax cuts do help the rich get richer, but the benefits don't trickle down. Another independent, credible source doing this. One of my favorite pieces of research on this, though, was by the Congressional Research Service. And they actually looked at federal tax policy, the top tax rates for rich individuals and corporations, and all changes to them, increases or decreases, from the end of World War II through 2010, a 65-year period. It's a pretty good test period. And this is what they found. Top tax rates, this is in the US specifically, have little or no relationship to the size of the economic pie. There's no statistically meaningful correlation between cutting or raising these taxes, that is on rich people and businesses, and economic growth, savings, investment, or productivity. Let's stop letting politicians get away with claiming supply side cuts trickle down and create economic benefits. They don't. Ever. Never have, never will. Now, you know, why is that? And I'm going to tell you why supply side policy has never worked. Have you ever heard any of the folks that are proponents of this approach to economics say, well, we're cutting taxes on the job creators? Anybody heard that? They're not the job creators. You know who the job creators are? Get a mirror. It's you and me. It's consumers. About 70% of all economic activity is consumer spending. The best consumers, low and moderate income folks. Why? They don't save. Why don't they save? If you look at their incomes on an inflation-adjusted basis over time, they're declining. So they basically spend their whole paycheck on crazy stuff like food and rent and car repairs, that kind of thing. So when you cut taxes on affluent people who have incredibly growing incomes over time in real inflation-adjusted terms, you're not stimulating any more consumer spending. They're already spending everything they can spend. So it doesn't generate the kind of economic activity that a tax cut focused on low-income folks would, like the earned income tax credit. It very much stimulates economics because what happens? They take that credit and they spend it on stuff in their local economy. All right, the second reason it doesn't work is corporations get a tax break. Why would they take the money from the tax break and create a new job? What's their economic incentive for doing that? You know, I can't believe I have to say the Small Business Administration did this study, but they did. They did a study that said, hey, gee, tax cuts for businesses really don't encourage them to create new jobs. You know what does? Growing demand for what they sell. Apparently microeconomics 101 is logical and works. So if you cut a business's taxes, but there's no growing demand for what they sell, they won't hire a new person. That would be wasteful excess capacity you don't need. We allow this rhetoric to distort our understanding of how the economy works and how fiscal policy works. So I'm just going to give you some evidence against supply side. And this is the data from the US. We have a full report about this on our website. We are updating it now for obvious reasons. This one came out a couple of years ago. And so you look at the far left-hand column, those were the highest tax rates from the end of World War II through 1980 on top income brackets at the federal level. The first for individuals and right underneath that for corporations. That's pre-supply side, right? Pre the Reagan era, 1981 when tax cuts happened. Then from 1981 to 2024, you see the new rates. Those higher rates, the 69%, that only applied the first year Reagan as he was cutting the taxes. So that really is not indicative of what the top rate was. The top rate really has been in the 30s ever since then. And then you see the top business rates. So let's look at how things happened. Go to the next line after the rates. Just look at that. Average annual non-residential fixed income growth. 8.9% before tax cuts for the wealthy and businesses a year, 5.5% after. Worse. How about average annual employment growth, 2.2% pre-tax cuts, 1.2% post-tax cuts. Employment grew slower. How about average unemployment rate? Well, that got higher after we started cutting taxes on businesses and rich folks. And then how about average GDP growth? That got a full percentage point lower. It's like $300 billion a year less on average in economic growth. The data are just so compelling, but wait, there's more. So once again, same comparison, same rates. How about wage growth? Trickle down, right? We're supposed to see this monstrous increase in incomes for people at the bottom and middle. Didn't happen. So during the period of higher taxation on the affluent and businesses, the aggregate wage growth was 84%, dropped down to 46% from 1981 to 2023. Huge decrease. How about from folks in the next bracket, 90 to 95%? These folks should be doing well, right? They were doing better before we cut taxes. Their wage growth was 111% and went down to 80%. How about 95 to 99%? Now we're really up there near the top, right? They still did worse after tax cuts for the wealthiest. Who did really, really good? The top 1%. They saw their aggregate income growth jump from 101% to 170%. So you know those findings from the International Monetary Fund, the London School of Economics, that these tax cuts worsen income inequality? Here would be your data for the US. But by the way, it happened this way in every other industrialized nation that tried it. All right, so what can we anticipate happening here and what will be happening here? First of all, the economy is going to grow slower. That is all the projections. This is the data on that. I'm not going to get that too much. The deficit's going to get worse. That red bar that hangs over towards the right, that's how much the deficit is projected to grow net after even you offset the Medicaid cuts and the SNAP cuts and the environmental cuts and the Medicare cuts. We're still going to have a pretty significant growth in our federal deficit. So what does the bill do from like a cut and investment standpoint? Well, let's talk about SNAP, the program that provides access to traditional food for low-income populations. Over the next 10 years, it's going to be cut by $186 billion with a B. You know what we spend on SNAP in a typical year? Somewhere between 98 and 110 billion. So it's effectively cutting 2 full years of SNAP funding. And it's spread over 10 years, but that's getting cut. Clean energy disinvestment is going to be huge. 40% cut to the EPA. They are terminating, you know, all the research shows that historically, because of discriminatory zoning laws and all that stuff, low-income populations, black and brown populations specifically, have been segregated in communities that have worse environmental, you know, atmospheres, right? They're closer to environmental waste. They're closer to businesses that produce a bunch of environmental waste. So a number of laws have been passed recently that says that's not right. We need to clean that up. And here are some investments that go to clean up these communities that are disproportionately low income and disproportionately minority. All that funding gone. That was all taken out. Increased funding for Homeland and Security and ICE, however, that's going in. So there's a new investment in $45 billion to expand the capacity of ICE to actually take immigrants into custody, and another $31 billion to train ICE officials, give them more facilities, et cetera, et cetera. So we're cutting things like clean environment and nutrition programs for low-income populations. We are investing in ICE. We are going to reduce the amount of forbearance students with student loans can take. So that's going to save $300 million for the feds. It's going to cost students $300 million who have those loans. We're also going to reduce Pell Grant eligibility and by some $200 million. And Pell Grants are the federal grants to help the poor attend the university. Why do we want to help poor kids attend university? Let me give you some data there. In 1980, a college grad earned 35% more than a high school grad. By 2022, that had jumped up to 87% more. If you want to be viable for a high-paying, good benefit job in the modern economy, you need an accreditation post-high school. You just do. All the data show that. There are no contrary data at all. And I've had people, well, you know, Ralph, I've heard that it's no guarantee that no. It doesn't guarantee you get a good paying job, getting a credential post-high school. Not getting one pretty much does guarantee you won't get one, though. So that's how that works. So really, we do want to invest in creating access to opportunity for low-income populations so that they have the chance to leave being a low-income person and moving up the income ladder. And in fact, it's very powerful from an income mobility standpoint. All right, Social Security insolvency is going to accelerate under this legislation. It means it gets insolvent sooner. What's the impact of that? Well, the yellow bar shows you poverty rates among seniors by demographics. When Social Security becomes insolvent and so benefits get cut automatically, you can see what those poverty rates jump to. I just thought I'd give you like real life impacts. So for Black folks, when this insolvency rate comes aboard, their poverty rate will go up from 9.9% to 16.2%. You can see the Hispanic rate jumps, the white rate jumps, other jumps. So that disinvestment caused by the One Big Beautiful Bill Act is going to exacerbate and quicken poverty for low-income seniors, and the demographic distribution of that increase in poverty is structurally racist. So we have that to look forward to. Medicaid cuts. The biggest thing on the table to help pay for the $4.4 trillion in tax cuts that primarily benefit the wealthiest and big businesses is cutting Medicaid by close to $1 trillion over the next 10 years, $911 billion. At a minimum, there are other projections. We actually went with the most conservative projections here that we could find. So there are projections that put those cuts at $1 trillion. You know, we're conservative groups, so we put that in there at the lower rate. But what is Medicaid really? It provides health care coverage to 71 million Americans. That's 1 in 5. 1 in 5. 20% of our population gets their health care coverage through Medicaid. 1 in 4 children do. Over 8 in 10 kids who are in poverty get their health care this way. 1 in 6 adults, almost half of the adults in poverty. And how about this? More than a quarter of the people who are disabled between ages 19 and 64 get their health care through Medicaid, and 5 in 8 nursing home residents. This is what we're cutting. To pay for those tax cuts, which won't stimulate the economy, in fact, will grow the federal deficit and lead to slower economic growth, harming the economy for the next decade. Nationwide, projections really vary on how many people are going to end up losing health coverage, but it'll be somewhere between 10.3 and 17 million people. But you know, the most pernicious, and there's so many pernicious aspects of this legislation, but the most pernicious aspect of this is most of the people who lose coverage are entitled to get it. They're going to lose it because the paperwork requirements that have been put in place are so onerous, they just won't follow through and get it done. Or they'll make errors. And the folks who drafted this legislation knew it because they saw states that had similar onerous policies on applying for Medicaid lose folks from the rolls that were entitled to coverage just to save money. So they are literally kicking people off the rolls who are entitled to be on them to save some revenue to pay for these tax cuts. That's their intent. Harvard and Yale also looked at this and they said, you know, we prevent a lot of deaths because we have Medicaid providing access to health care that folks otherwise wouldn't have. Well, now a lot of those preventable deaths are going to happen, and the range is between 8,200 and 51,000 people a year more will die of a preventable death because they don't have access to health care because they lost their Medicaid. So it's not just a fiscal impact. I mean, it literally means additional Americans will die. Out-of-pocket expenses are going to rise for enrollees. I don't know if you're reading the papers, but we're already seeing this stuff happening, right? It's already in the newspapers. So this was the projections that folks were making at the time. The projections are coming true in real time. Yeah, I think there's even there might be an article, it was today's or yesterday's New York Times summarizing a bunch of them. Anyway, it's out there now. And of course, ABA, prohibits use of Medicaid funding for family planning, because who needs that? Now, what would be the impact of these cuts in the state of Illinois? And there are a number of different estimates, and I think the HFS, Health and Family Services estimates of the state itself are too low. That's why I included the estimates from the Kaiser Foundation and from Manat. These are two very respected organizations that really do a ton of research, credible research on healthcare and healthcare issues all the time. So I'm guessing the actual loss of coverage in Illinois will be in that 330,000 to 544,000 range. You can see it's either 1 in 10 to 1 in 6 enrollees in our state will lose coverage. Average premiums of people who get their health insurance through the ACA exchanges is going to go up by over $1,000 a year. So I'm glad you all have an extra $1,000 lying around. You can contribute your other extra $1,000 to the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. We are a nonprofit 501c3. Thank you very much. But, with all that extra money, why not? I'll ask for it as long as, people are just throwing it away. Illinois is going to lose, and the Manat estimate is really the one to look at, $51 billion in federal funding. We've looked at these numbers about 9 different ways, and we can't come up with any way that's less than $51 billion. Actually, a number of our projections are slightly higher, so we'll stick with the lower Manat projection. We think, once again, the HFS estimate is off base. It's just too conservative. Rural hospitals are going to be brutalized in Illinois. They're going to lose about $6.4 billion in healthcare payments. And that's going to jeopardize their capacity to stay in business. And we're expecting at least 9 hospitals to go out of business in rural Illinois. And, they're not going to be replaced. I mean, that's just going to be a loss of access to healthcare services. But it's also going to be an economic loss. People don't usually understand the relationship between public sector spending and the private sector economy, but it's a positive one. And basically, for every dollar spent on a basic core service, healthcare, education, public safety, social services, those kinds of things, you get $1.40 in private sector economic activity. So there's a really strong positive multiplier effect. These multipliers were identified by a PhD economist named Mark Zandi. Zandi is the top economist at Moody's, the bond rating agency, and he's not some crazy liberal, just in case you're concerned about that. When McCain ran for the presidency, Republican McCain, Senator McCain, against Obama, Zandi was McCain's principal economic advisor. So he's a Republican PhD economist at a bond rating agency. That's not the profile of a liberal. I'm just saying that right now. He looked at these interactions between state and federal spending on services and the private sector economy over a 50-year period and tried to suss out what statistically meaningful relationship there was. And this is what came out of that research, about $1.40 for every dollar spent. So if we take those dollars out, that means in addition to losing $6.4 billion of healthcare coverage, rural Illinois is going to lose about $9 billion of economic activity in its private sector. And we all know that, rural Illinois could afford that. And here's the Medicare slide. And this is happening, the bigger cuts on Medicare, there's some direct cuts that'll cause about 1.3 million folks to lose access to Medicare. That's the bottom bullet point there. But we have this federal legislation that was passed a few years back in 2010 called the PAYGO legislation, right? And so if any new federal bill increases the deficit over the baseline projections in the upcoming decade, that increase in the deficit is automatically offset under the workings of this legislation through a process called sequestration, to the extent that it can be offset against certain programs. Now, some programs are exempt from sequestration. Medicaid is, for instance. Medicare is not. So there is a limit to the cuts you could impose on Medicare under sequestration of 4% a year, but it's going to lose the 4% a year. So Medicare over the next 10 years will be cut by $536 billion. Papers aren't even covering this. I have yet to see the politician that goes out on the stump and says, you know what I'm going to do to solve our budget problems? I'm going to slash spending on Medicare. You know why politicians don't say that? It's one of the most popular programs in the history of the United States. And seniors vote. And in fact, the chief architects of this legislation and the chief proponents of it, President Trump, Speaker Johnson, all said Medicare's not touched. They said Medicaid isn't touched. So they either didn't understand how their own legislation works, not likely, or, I don't know, they were lying. I say this wasn't spin because the impacts are so severe, you know, at least $911 billion in cuts to Medicaid over a 10-year period, $536 billion in cuts to Medicare. You got to know that. So to say that you're not touching these things when you're a proponent of a piece of legislation, I can't buy that you didn't understand it. Anyway, so now the environmental cuts. What are those impacts in Illinois? None of them good. We're going to lose about 52,000 jobs in the private sector that were environmental related jobs. Residential energy bills are going to pump up by about $400 a year because the cost of energy is going to go up. We have this climate clean energy grid goal of 100% by 2050. Gone, can't make it. Air pollution, I love this one. It's going to bump up by 3 million metric tons by 2030 and 6 million metric tons by 2035. Be happy you live in Peoria. I live in the Chicago area, which has the worst air quality in our state, right? The highest asthma incidence because of it. We are going to just get whacked in Chicago. It's going to be horrible. All right. Obviously, a lot of other things are going to get bad, but we're going to lose another $16.8 billion in a combination of the public sector grants that were cut and the private sector investments that would have gone along with those grants. And so a lot of economic activity is going to go away. And you could take that same $1.4 multiplier times the $16.8 billion to see what the real impact will be on our economy. And bottom line, not pretty. It'll be ugly. Then they changed the child tax credit and they actually increased it. And, you know, increasing the child tax credit is a good thing. It has really been a positive thing. In 2021, for instance, it lifted 3.7 million kids out of poverty, reducing the monthly child poverty rate by like 30 percentage points. That's a good thing, 30 points. But here's what they did. They increased it, but they made the full increase non-refundable. What's the refundability feature? If you have a refundable tax credit, that means, let's say you qualify for a credit of $250, but you only owe $100 in income taxes. Obviously, $250 is more than $100. You don't pay the $100. That leaves a balance of $150 that you get a check for. You get the full value of the credit, even if it's greater than what you owe in income taxes. And that's why refundable credits are so powerful as an anti-poverty device. They end up, through the income tax code, offsetting other taxes you may happen to pay. It's been real effective bipartisan policy. For instance, the earned income tax credit is one of the most well-known refundable tax credits the federal government gives. Passed initially under Richard Nixon, who was a huge supporter, hugely increased by Ronald Reagan, who was a huge supporter, increased under George W. Bush, who was a huge supporter. I mean, this is bipartisan stuff. But they took the refundability feature away. So now it's only people with enough income will claim the additional credit. So once again, it cuts low and low moderate income families out of the increased benefit. Why you would do that is beyond me. But that's precisely what they do. But they did one other thing with the child tax credit, which is nasty. It used to be if a child was born in the US, automatically a US citizen, got a social security number, even if their parents didn't. And if a child had a social security number, that child qualified for the credit, no more. Now their parent also has to have a social security number. In Illinois, 196,000 children will become ineligible to claim the credit for their parents because of that change in law. These are American kids. These are US citizen kids that are losing the value of this credit. And their parents are paying taxes because they're able to claim the credit against their taxes. How the bill works. Impact on higher ed, I don't want to kill this one. You all know we're disinvesting in higher education. We're cutting grants. Johns Hopkins, you've probably heard of Johns Hopkins. It's an okay university. Had to lay off 237 staffers due to a loss of $800 million in grants. I mean, we're disinvesting in our best universities. We're actually losing one of the core economic advantages America's had over the rest of the world. The rest of the world sent their best and brightest to the US universities to be educated for generations, and many of them decided to stay. And so we really were an importer of brilliant minds, and not doing that anymore. We're doing everything we can to disinvest in universities and to make it more difficult for foreign students to come and attend university in the US. The visa restrictions, that's the bottom point down there, are creating havoc. I'm at Roosevelt University. We've seen our international populations decline significantly on a year-to-year basis because of this. And a number of our international students that are already here are having trouble staying. So it's problematic. Impact is going to be big. We're expecting, just go to the bottom line here instead of looking at all the busy stuff. I'm going to share these slides so you could have all this data. And if you have trouble sleeping at night, feel free. But the bottom line, Illinois' economy is going to lose about $380 million because we're going to lose close to 10,000 international students and 3,600 jobs associated with those students. So it's not even cutting off your nose to spite your face. It's cutting off your nose, your ear, and a foot to spite somebody else. I don't understand why this is our policy. Now, this isn't part of the OBA, but I just thought, since I was talking about education, I'd give you a little bit of what else is happening in education for K-12. The Trump administration is holding up $6.1 billion in funding for K-12 nationwide. It's 14.4% of all funds that go to K-12 education, and it's just being held. No reason. Illinois, about $218 million. There have been a number of court orders that have come out that have said the administration has to release the funding. Administration hasn't yet. I don't know if the administration cares about inconveniences like court orders, but we will see what happens here. The bottom line is they're disinvesting in higher ed, disinvesting in low-income students' access to higher ed, and they're disinvesting in K-12. And not only are they disinvesting in K-12, they're trying to steer K-12 investments away from what they're traditionally used for and to vouchers. And when I say traditionally used for, poverty grants. So Title I is the big poverty funding program. Everybody knows of Title I in the US. Now, a lot of the money that's going through Title I, the administration is holding back and encouraging states to use it for voucher programs, which could subsidize the sending of a child to a private school, a private religious school, whatever. Education choice, that's a hot button issue, but I'm going to, because I study education, it's part of what I do as my sidekick in addition to the work I do on budget stuff. I served on a federal commission on educational excellence and equity in the Civil Rights Division of the DOE and looked at systems of finance in K-12 and what it really means. Vouchers don't work if by working you mean generating better educational outcomes for the kids who use them. There is a huge study done of all K-12 education by the Bush administration, George W., the kid, right, George W. He hired two researchers out of the University of Illinois at the time. They're now at Indiana University, a married couple, Chris and Sarah Lubienski, PhDs in education and econometrics. And the Lubienskis were given access to federal data sets on education that no one was given access to ever in the history of America before. One of the two, Sarah, the principal mathematician of the two, went to all conservative Christian schools her whole life. They were commissioned by the administration of George W. Bush. And they said, tell us what happens, educational outcomes, are there really differentials, private schools, public schools, et cetera? Well, at first blush, private schools outperform. public schools until you control for demographics. The second you control for demographics, low-income populations, minority populations, public schools greatly outperform private schools. So, from just an educational policy standpoint, diverting public taxpayer money away from public education to subsidize kids going to private schools cannot be expected to generate better educational outcomes, particularly for traditionally disadvantaged populations. The best use of the public dollar would be investing in public education to the level that's needed. We in Illinois are fortunate enough to have a school funding formula that passed in 2017 called the Evidence-Based Model of Student Success that actually ties the amount of money we're investing in school districts to covering the cost of those research-based educational practices that have a statistically meaningful correlation to improving student achievement. Now, we're underfunding that model by about $3.4 billion. But if we get it fully funded, every kid in Illinois, no matter where they live, no matter their race, no matter their income, will walk into a school that has all the resources it needs to deliver an education that will allow that child to succeed to that child's potential. Taking money out of that to fund a system that won't generate better educational outcomes, how is that a good use of taxpayer money? I'm not against school choice. People have the right. Parents, of course, you want to send for religious. I went to a Catholic school first to 8th grade. My parents, my mom, Santa Rosa. I mean, Catholicism was important to my mom. She wanted me to get that Catholic background. That's okay. That's our choice. The public sector shouldn't pay for it in any way, shape, or form. And especially not if what we want are better academic outcomes, which I think everybody always wants. And then we're going to look at the impact of this legislation on the state of Illinois' budget. Will it be good? Let me think about it. No, it'll be very bad. So we already have a structural deficit, which means just adjusting for inflation and population change, assuming a normal economy, assuming no program is increased or expanded beyond current levels, our revenue growth won't be enough to cover what we currently do today, tomorrow. That's the problem. And so there's a number of provisions in this legislation that'll cost us some money. Number one, some of these tax cuts, the tip deduction and overtime deduction, because our law on income taxes is piggybacked on the feds, those are automatic tax cuts in Illinois. So over the next 10 years, that'll cost us $598 million. That's what this shows you. The other tax costs for the additional senior deduction doesn't automatically cost us. We would have to opt into that one. Then there's the changes to some of the corporate tax policies. Those all impact us. And I'm just giving you some of the quick numbers here. I want to get to the bottom line. So the bottom line is the corporate tax breaks and individual tax breaks are going to cost us some $836 million in lost revenue. And we already have a structural deficit. So it's not revenue neutral to us. The state of Illinois, no one in Illinois in the General Assembly or our government voted to cut our tax revenue. But it's going to automatically happen because of the operation of federal law. Obviously, I talked a little bit about Medicaid, but I do want to get to what Medicaid cuts will mean for our state. We will lose somewhere between go to the top line there, $48 to $52 billion in Medicaid funding over the next decade. I already talked about the impact on low-income communities. It's going to be bad. Largest decline in federal Medicaid spending in rural areas. Illinois is third worst in the country based on the OBA cuts. So the hits we are going to get in Illinois are worse than most other states for our rural communities. I just wanted to highlight that, but I want to get to sort of the bottom line. We're going to lose 55 to 60,000 jobs. We're going to lose funding at local levels, blah, blah, blah. We're going to lose a lot of money. I'm going to get to one big chart. I'm running short on time, so I'm flying through these slides. Once again, I'm going to share them with you. SNAP program. So if we wanted to make up for all the cuts in SNAP, this year our budget for SNAP, because we do have some costs associated with SNAP at the state level, is $140 million. That's this year's budget. Next year, that would have to go up to $705 million. to make up for what they're doing. So to put it all together, which is what this slide does, the average annual cost to our general fund over the next year, 10 years, will be about $5 billion a year. To make up for what they're doing, revenue losses, Medicaid cuts, SNAP cuts, et cetera, we would have to have an additional $5 billion just to keep things where they are today. A year. We won't. We already have a structural deficit. I mean, we probably need to just keep doing tomorrow what Illinois does today. We'd probably need to raise taxes in our state somewhere around 5 or 6 billion. So now lump on top of this another 5 billion. You know, talking 10 billion. Pretty soon you're talking real money in scope of an increase. So I'm going to stop the presentation here because I think does that hit me at the time at about right? Okay, good. The rest of this stuff is talking about solutions the state could consider to its own fiscal problems. I think the big picture is Americans have been sold truly a bill of goods on this piece of legislation. It was sold as something that's going to stimulate our economy, that's going to benefit everyone. It's sold as incorporating first ever tax breaks on tips and overtime and stuff to really help. And it was snake oil salesmanship. The benefits of this legislation are really going to the wealthiest of the wealthy, but it's going to cause significant economic, healthcare, nutritional, environmental harm to the vast majority of Americans. And I'm not the only person saying that. The former Republican governor of Montana is saying that. Marjorie Taylor Greene is saying that. So we need to be very active, I think, in working our legislators in this state that are Republicans who supported this to, in the next year or two, undo it, or at least undo as much of it as we can. Because for as long as Trump is president, unless the Republicans stand up to him, it's going to be really hard to pull back the biggest negatives from this legislation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ralph. And if I can invite you to have a seat, we're going to go through questions for about the next 15 minutes of time. And Eileen is going to give me the high sign in the back when it's time to
I was watching Eileen like the fox says. Thank you, by the way.
Yes, we appreciate that. So I want to start off first by diving into the Medicaid cuts and health care, if we can, because the largest employment sector in Peoria is now healthcare rather than manufacturing. So talk about, extend out your thoughts a little bit, if you can, on the job losses in the area. We know the human cost of it that you went into with the additional deaths, but the potential job losses when that industry has to contract.
52,000 jobs statewide. I mean, we're going to lose a lot of jobs, and there's no way to avoid it. Look, this is why the investments from the federal government in our healthcare system are so powerful economically for us, right? So it's taking money from out of the state and it's putting it into our state to cover our healthcare needs. And when it's doing that, what's it really paying for? It's mostly paying for the salaries of the professionals in the healthcare industry and not just the top like surgeons and nurses aides, orderlies. So as they receive income, they then turn around and spend it in their local communities. And this is where you get that positive multiplier. So that's why it's so bad. We're going to lose those jobs. Those people won't have that income. They won't be spending their income in their local communities. Their local communities will see their economy shrink. People will lose other jobs. So the direct job loss doesn't even tell the story.
Well, and there's also a follow-on effect to this too, right? Because whether you are covered by Medicaid or not covered by Medicaid, when you present yourself in an emergency room, you have to be treated.
Yeah.
And that cost is then borne by everybody else funding the healthcare system, right? So that will actually increase additional costs on all of us as consumers, yes?
Yeah. Can't not because one of the most powerful parts of Medicaid is encouraging populations that generally don't get any preventative care to get preventative care. So when they stop getting preventative care because they've lost the ability to pay for it through their Medicaid coverage, they'll stop getting it and they'll get sicker. And more of them will end up in ER and we'll end up paying a lot more for that. Hard to make those projections, so that's why there's not numbers on that. But we like to have credibility. Very credible data. This stuff we talk about is always controversial. So, we vet the data, we peer review it and all that other stuff. So it's hard to do a projection on that, but will it happen? Yes. Will it be significant? Yes.
Yeah. Now, regarding the SNAP eligibility changes, the reductions there in federal funding, and in the short term, we just saw today the governor announced another $20 million directed to Illinois food banks, mostly taking into account the lack of SNAP benefits expected during the shutdown starting Monday for everybody. In the longer term, though, financially, is there any sort of point where it makes sense for Illinois to redirect more of its funding into that $700 million we would need to make up for the cuts in order to keep that economic activity going, again, in addition to the human benefit of people receiving food?
Well, I'd like to throw in a room full of legislators that are trying to put together the budget and ask that same question. So right now, we have a $52 billion budget at the state of Illinois. But a portion of that goes to like hard costs, like our pension debt, our other debt, or things that flow out of the system. So really, we're only spending about 39 billion on services. How do we spend that money? 95 cents out of every dollar goes to education, health, social services, and public safety. So right now, you think about a $39 billion budget, 95% of which goes to education, health, social services, and public safety. And now you want to elbow in another $600 million, over $500 million for food. Where are you going to cut it? You're going to cut it from education, health, social services, and public safety, because that's where you're spending. So that's why it's not a no-brainer for the state to do this, and that's why we put the total impact up to that $5 billion a year. You think about $5 billion just to replace what's being taken away, and they can't even afford to continue their current level. So this is not an easy discussion for legislators to have. This is why the following slides that I didn't have time to get into ways for the state to responsibly deal with its fiscal problems and generate the revenue and save the cost, particularly on its pension debt, that would put it in a better position. Absorbing all of that, though, not going to happen.
Wholly unrehearsed, but since you do bring it up, can you describe very briefly a couple of those options, refinancing the pension debt and...
I think I could even show a slide about it.
Yeah, show us one or two more slides.
Yeah, and you could all ask questions. This is Q&A. So this is our pension debt. You add those two bars together in any given year, that's how much under our pension ramp legislation that passed back in 1995 requires us to put into the pension systems. Now, we passed this back in 1995 because the state's funded ratio, that is the percentage of assets to liabilities, was only 54%. That's not good. That is bad. To be considered healthy, the GAO in DC wants you at 80% funded. Standard & Poor's also wants you at 80%. Fitch's wants you at 70%. The Actuary Association wants you at 100%. But no matter who you pick, 54% no bueno. So they said, all right, we're going to pass a new law that's going to require us to put into the systems what we didn't with interest, so that by the year 2045, that out year on this ramp, will be 90% funded. So healthy by most metrics, right? That was the good news. The bad news was they didn't pass a nickel of revenue to fund it. And the reason they got to the point where they were underfunding their pensions was they had that structural deficit for decades. So what they did was they created a backloaded payment plan that let them underfund the pensions for an additional 15 years. So the reason you see two colors in this bar That red bar is the normal cost of funding your benefits over time. The orange bar on top of it is the debt service plan from 1995. It's not about the cost of the benefits. It's about repaying the debt with interest on a backloaded basis, which is idiotic. So and that's a fiscal term, idiotic, I hope. So this graphic just shows, so that red line, that's current law, okay? That's the pension ramp. The green bars are what we would replace the pension ramp with. That's the new state taxpayer pension payments. The blue bars are pension obligation bonds that we would issue over a 5-6 year period to put into the pension systems to retire some debt and turn debt into assets, but prepay it. And through the magic of compounding interest and doing a couple of other things, the state currently pays its pension payment on the last day of the fiscal year. We moved that to the first day of the fiscal year, getting a full extra 12 months of investment return on the payment, right, over a 30-year period. You do all that and you save $46 billion between now and 2045, and you still get 90% funded. So this is something they ought to do. And we met with the governor last year. Senator Kim Lightford is a big proponent of this. State Representative Carol Amons is. Will Davis, another state rep. Cam Buckner, another state rep. And so we met with the governor, and we put this, not the governor, his budget team, and met and put all this stuff on the table. And we said, look, if you have any questions, ask us, but you should do it. And Kim Lightford, even in the meeting, she says, look, just moving the payment, this is true, saves over $10 billion. At a minimum, let's just save $10 billion by changing the date we make the payment. And we got back crickets. So no response, no questions, whatever. So we're going to try to push this year. This would be something to work on your local legislators with. Tell them you support the re-amortization of the pension debt the way CTBA is proposed. In fact, the city of Chicago has a similar problem. We've worked out a similar re-amortization of Chicago's debt, and Alderman Gilbert Villegas put in a resolution because the city doesn't control their repayment, the state does. Put in a resolution asking Springfield to re-amortize the debt the way CTBA said, so the city of Chicago to save $10 billion on theirs. But the bottom line is it saves us tax increases and or spending cuts because we have to fund this. So it's not like this is volitional. And why would you waste $46 billion on debt service you don't need to waste? Why would you waste taxpayer money on that could be spent on education, health, social services, public safety, and or insulating yourself from these OBA cuts?
Cool. Okay, I've got a couple other audience questions here. I want to hit on one other first about directly on the state budget, because one of the pieces of rhetoric that we regularly hear is that Illinois government is wildly inefficient in a number of ways, and if you concentrate on fighting waste, fraud, and abuse, you can produce taxpayer savings. I would like to hear your point of view in addressing that, and recognizing Illinois has never seen $1 billion of natural revenue growth just from a reform like that ever.
So this is Illinois. Why don't we just have a line item for waste, fraud, and abuse and be done with it? So this year, you guys, you get to waste, fraud, and abuse X. Go have the party, have fun. But is there waste, fraud, and abuse in the state budget? Of course. Is it material? No. So the RAND Corporation, which is one of the most respected international think tanks, did a huge study on waste. And this was a while ago, so it's a little dated. I used this study when I was on that federal commission. So it was around 2012, 2013 that I had access to the study in DC. And they looked at waste at the public sector level, state and local, and tried to come up with an algorithm to determine how much is there. And what they basically found was there is waste. But if you were to make government as efficient as possible and eliminate all waste, you can't do that. You can't do that in anything. Show me the private sector business with zero waste. It doesn't exist. It's not on the planet. But if you could do it, you might save 2 to 3%. Fine. For those that want to go find that 2-3%, I'm all for saving it. Put it on the table. Let's go save it. But what people don't understand about public sector efficiency is public sector services are in fact labor intensive.
Mm-hmm.
Education, health, social, they're labor intensive. So you're not more efficient educating children with larger class sizes and less teachers.
The opposite, right?
You're the opposite. So you really have to understand efficiency in context. So it is the biggest red herring in the world. And if you actually look at state expenditures on those 4 core services, education, health, social service, public safety this year, and compare them to the year 2000 under Republican Governor George Ryan, and you adjust for inflation, we're spending less, about 9-10% less today than we did in the year 2000 under Republican Governor George Ryan. So there's not a lot to find there. I think you need to focus on the tougher part, which is the revenue side of the ledger. And politicians always say, well, I'm here to make the tough choices. No, you're here to avoid the tough choices. The toughest choices are always the revenue choices. But the bottom line is, if you have inadequate fiscal capacity, i.e. revenue on the front end, you will get inadequate outcomes on the back end. That's in business and that's in the public sector. So we need to fix our revenue system. It doesn't work in a modern economy. We need to re-amortize our pension debt in a logical fashion to save billions of dollars. And look, if we were to raise the income tax rate by 1.5 points, so you go from 4.9 to 6.5%, and then you say, all right, we want some tax fairness. And unfortunately, we can't have a graduated structure because our state constitution doesn't permit it. We have to have one flat rate. But we can have refundable credits. We already have the EITC in Illinois that's refundable. It's absolutely constitutional in Illinois to have a refundable credit. If you designed a refundable credit that eliminated that tax increase from everyone with $75,000 a year or less in taxable income, that's 77% of the taxpayers in Illinois. That's 4.9 million taxpayers would pay nothing more. You generate $3.7 billion and only the top 23% pays it. $3.7 billion. That's what the old fair tax proposal would have generated. You expand our sales tax base to include consumer services. Of all the states, of the 46 states with a sales tax, we have one of the most narrow bases because we don't tax consumer services. We primarily tax goods. Goods are 17% of our economic activity. Services are 73%. Consumer services are about 50%. If we expanded the base to services, we would generate at least $2 billion in new revenue. And lo and behold, you've generated $5.5, almost $6 billion in new revenue, which sounds like a lot of money. I know, it does sound like a lot of money. We have a $1.2 trillion economy. It's not even a rounding error in the Illinois economy. You can't measure it, it's so small for what impact it is. There's no peer-reviewed econometric model that can tell you if this will have a positive or negative impact because it's too small. So it is a big number, but context really matters in a state like Illinois. It would solve a lot of problems. It wouldn't solve all the federal problems too. It would solve our current fiscal problems. We'd be able to fully fund K-12. We'd be able to restore higher ed to where it should be from a funding standpoint. We'd be able to reinvest in human services and restore all the cuts that were made during the Rauner administration. So we'd put ourselves in a much better footing than where we are today, and we'd be able to cover some of the Trump stuff.
All right. And I want to close us out with one final question that actually addresses that, and your mention of rebuilding some of the fiscal challenges from the Rauner administration to these programs is the right setup for it. The question is, how do we unwind this act? And I'm going to take it farther than that because that's in large part a political decision. I want to ask you, what would be the timeline on addressing those challenges? You talk about the Rauner problems in 2025 for an administration that ended in 2019, that we still have not rebuilt some of those agencies from. What would be the timeline if
you'd need the resources? So I can't, without the resources, you can't rebuild. So with our current fiscal system, we can't fully fund K-12 education according to the evidence-based model for another 10 or 15 years. Why? Why are we going to lose another generation and a half of kids to an underfunded system? And particularly when, You know, the National Center for Economic Research, really one of the most credible organizations out there, looked at things like the evidence-based model and these kinds of reforms for education. And they said, yes, they in fact will generate substantially better educational outcomes. You can expect it 10 years after they're fully funded, because you need a full cohort of kids to go through an adequately funded system to see the statistically meaningful delta. So waiting another 10 to 15 years to fully fund it means we're waiting another 25 to 30 years to see really Why would we do that in a state like Illinois? We have the 5th largest economy in America. Our economy is so big as a state. If we were an independent country, it'd be the 20th largest economy in the world. We have a larger economy than Saudi Arabia, okay? Ireland, Greece, Norway, you hear any of these places? Nigeria with all that oil money. So, I mean, we can build our fiscal capacity to restore what was cut. We don't rebuild our fiscal capacity to do that. We can't. So you ask me how long, tell me when the revenue's coming in the door, and I'll start modeling it out for you.
All right. Thank you, Ralph. We appreciate you taking the time to come down to Peoria, especially on the final day of the legislature's fall veto session, when they may be dealing with some of this still. We'll know between now and about midnight tonight what gets done.
Oh, they know how to find me.
Absolutely. As a reminder to everybody who is here, the league is open for membership to anybody age 16 and older, regardless of gender. You can find more on our website about how to join, lwvgp.org, and I believe we may have some membership information outside as well. And if you're interested, make sure we have your name from your sign-in. We'll get you that information so you can join. We also hope that you'll join us at 2 additional upcoming league events, including coffee for new and prospective members on Saturday, November 8 at the Peoria in Westlake, starting at 10:30 in the morning, and at our next Drinks and Dialogue event, beginning at 5:30 p.m. on Wednesday, November 19 at the Lariat Steakhouse, featuring a discussion with retired Assistant Peoria Police Chief Lisa Snow about criminal justice-related issues. Again, thank you all for being here, and thank you, Ralph.
Real quick, you said you shared these slides. How do we get those?
We will go ahead and distribute them. I'll link to them
In
probably through our
PDF.
website as a PDF. With the next league email, your newsletter is coming out at the start of the week next week, so we'll have it in there.
We used to share the PowerPoint, by the way, and now we only share it in PDF because there's another organization in the state that I won't name that would take our material and change stuff and recirculate it with our name still on it. So we said, all right, it's got to go out in PDF. Sorry, but that's how it has to be.
Fair enough. All right, thank you.